Hello, everyone. So, we're going to start with chapter 1 this week, which is just kind of going to give you a broad idea of what economics is. So, here's the outline for this lecture. We're going to talk about what economic activity is, what some economic questions are. We're going to talk about types of economics, goals and well being, agents and externalities. And then finally, we're going to close up with the first two kind of formal models that we're going to approach in this class, the production possibilities frontier and the circular flow diagram. So diving right into it, let's talk about what economics is. Economics is the study of how people manage their resources to meet their needs and enhance their well-being. Well, that definition needs a bit more clarification, right? First of all, what's a resource? Well, we can think of resources as being both natural and produced. So a natural resource is, trees in the woods, minerals in the ground, that sort of thing. But resources are also produced. We can think about resources as products that we can purchase in the store. We can also think about them more abstractly as human capital, the skills that we have to be productive in the economy. Then the next kind of step here is what's a need. So economists don't typically make a distinction between needs and wants. Just people have desires and they want to fulfill them. So generally speaking, in this definition, we're talking about needs in terms of just things people want. And finally, well-being. We can think about well-being as a good quality of life beyond the bare essentials. This has many different aspects to it that we'll talk about later in this lecture. But what is good in terms of well-being is oftentimes a subjective matter. And so it becomes kind of difficult to evaluate what exactly well-being is. And we'll talk about that a bit later in this lecture. So if that's what economics is, what do we study? Well, we study these four essential economic activities: resource management, production, distribution, and consumption. So, resource management means preserving or improving natural produced human and social resources. Production is activities that result in some good or service at the end. Distribution is how those goods and services are spread about the people that, inhabit society. And finally, consumption is the final use of a good or service. And so all of these activities take place in many different contexts. Yes, of course, the firm is managing its resources, producing them, distributing. Sure, households are consuming goods, but resource management takes place in the household as well, right? As does production. Doing the dishes is a service. Taking kids to soccer practice is a service, right? And those are also distributed within the household between the members of the household. So this takes place in many different types of institutions in the economy. All four of these activities also take place within governments, right? Even though governments aren't necessarily governed by market forces, economists are still interested in how governments manage their resources, produce outputs, distribute those outputs, and whenever consumption takes place within the government, how that is being undertaken. So our next kind of step, we've talked about what economics is, what we study. Well, here are kind of the three basic economic questions. What should be produced? How should production take place? And for whom should economic activity be undertaken? I think a really good illustrative example in this case is tariffs, right? So tariffs have a very direct impact on how should production take place, right? Should it take place, for instance, in the U.S., where U.S. citizens receive wage income as a result of it? Or should it take place elsewhere? Because there are trade-offs there, right? If a good or service is produced elsewhere where production can be undertaken more cheaply, that can change the qualities of the product, but it also reduces its costs, which results in maybe American consumers being able to consume that good at a lower price. So in that case, economic activity is being undertaken for consumers in the US and laborers in the other country, and vice versa if production took place in the US. We also can think about government policy, another government policy, as to what should be produced. So, for instance, governments regularly regulate the types and qualities of goods that can be produced in their economy for health and safety standards and other various political reasons. Broadly speaking, we split economics into two halves. You can slice it up other ways, but this is a very kind of simple way of thinking about it. At its very core, economics is about describing the economy. And so positive economics is the part of economics that deals with that. It is principally descriptive. An example of that would be, of a positive statement, would be when the price of gas falls, do people tend to drive more or less, right? And so if we understand the law of demand, which is something we'll talk about next week, we can say, well, holding other things equal, if the price of gas falls, people will likely drive more. On the other hand, normative economics asks questions about how things ought to be. And this is kind of where economics becomes a little more interesting because values come into play. The example I have here is, should the minimum wage be increased? And that the minimum wage increase creates a series of trade-offs that create some winners and some losers. And it's up to the economist and their values, clearly stated, to evaluate the impacts of that policy change. And finally, the art of economics is combining positive economics with normative economics to make real-world policy or business decisions. It is important to note that positive statements often have normative implications. As we'll talk about later in this course, minimum wages are immensely beneficial when labor markets are not competitive. But if labor markets are competitive, then they are less beneficial. And so the competitiveness of any particular labor market is a positive statement, while the value statement of should the minimum wage be increased is a normative statement. And so the positive statement about the competitiveness of the labor market has the consequence of what the cost-benefit analysis of the normative evaluation of that policy change would be. So, economists tend to think about things in terms of individuals and individual decision-making. People try to make decisions that will satisfy their goals and improve their well-being. And so they may have goals that are final or intermediary or mixed. So for instance, a final goal might be a comfortable retirement. And intermediate goals along that path might be to get an education, to get a job that will fund the retirement fund, right? And so these can all be mixed up, but also these intermediate goals could have kind of final aspects to themselves, right? Job satisfaction could be a final goal. So this kind of gets muddled a bit, because consumption we generally consider to be a final goal, and work and school we generally consider to be intermediate goals, but once again, there is some innate benefit to those that people may or may not enjoy. But thinking more broadly, we can have larger scale social goals in economics. So these are not goals of the individual, but goals of societies. And the classic goals that we have are typically going to be gross domestic product or economic efficiency. Economic efficiency simply means we're getting the most output for our inputs, and GDP is just the total value of goods and services produced within a country within a year. We really, as economists, didn't talk about GDP until the Great Depression, because before that, it was kind of taken as a given. Well, when GDP falls during a recession, then it'll right itself eventually. But the Great Depression drug on for many, many years, and so finally governments decided they had to do something, and to find out if their policies were making any difference, they had to start measuring GDP. And so that's where that measurement really comes from. Economic efficiency, on the other hand, really comes to us from economic theory, but we'll dig into that more next week. But more broadly, so these are the kind of traditional economic goals, but there's been a growing movement to think about social economic goals more broadly. So if we think about more than just incomes and production, we can think about people's well-being. And so this is a broader concept than GDP or economic efficiency that has all of these different areas that are very important. And there's these, if you look at them, they're very difficult to measure quantitatively. For instance, how does one objectively evaluate what fairness is? And the simple answer is that there is no objective value for objective standard for fairness, right? Or freedom. And so this is where we're kind of stepping into the normative space a bit more. We have to make some value judgments about what we as a society decide is important and what an economic system should produce. There's been some efforts to measure well-being in a more broad sense. Some examples of these are gross national happiness and the genuine progress indicator. We actually have a faculty member in our department who has tasked herself with calculating the genuine progress indicator at the state level for the state of Utah. And so there's ongoing research in this whole area to try to figure out ways of measuring these goals so that we can evaluate policy about them. So changing gears just a bit here, we're going to talk about agents and externalities. So externalities is really the important idea here, but we need to get agents nailed down before we can get to it. So an economic actor can be of various different things, individual, group, or organization that is involved in some economic activity. So this could be just a person, it could be a business, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a firm, a business. Sorry about that. Could be a government entity. These are all different potential economic actors. So if we think about this in the simplest case, typically speaking, there's going to be two economic actors that contract with one another. So you may have a firm contracting with another firm, an individual contracting with a firm, organization contracting with individuals or firms. So it could go either way. But if we think about just two at a time, one contracting with the other, they may be buying or selling something. They may be creating contingent agreements in the future. And usually, those agreements between economic actors only have effects for those two economic actors. For instance, if, you come to me and you want to purchase a bike from me on like KSL or whatever, and I sell you that bike, that really hasn't affected anyone else in the economy. But not all transactions are like that. Some transactions have side effects for other people who weren't involved in the transaction. And those transactions are said to cause externalities. So externalities are side effects or unintended consequences of economic activity that accrue to economic actors that are not directly involved in the activity. And these could be positive or negative. So let's go through a couple of examples here. So an example of a negative externality that's really well known is pollution, right? So if I purchase gasoline and drive my car, that creates some carbon dioxide that has effects for everyone else on the planet, regardless of their involvement in that transaction, right? And that's a negative externality. Another example could be mining, right? So mining damages the natural environment, which has effects for other individuals who do not directly benefit from that mining or are not directly contracted in the act of that mining. So for instance, if a mountain is kind of clear-cut mined, then people who had no say in that transaction now can no longer enjoy the natural benefit of that mountain, right? And so those are two examples of negative externalities, but there can also be positive externalities. So for instance, education is often cited as having a large positive externality, because when individuals are better educated, they tend to be more productive, they tend to be more well-adjusted in society, and they tend to just cause fewer problems for other people. So even though it's just, for instance, public schooling, if it's the state has entered into this transaction with an individual family that's going to educate their child, you benefit from that child being productive in the economy whenever they grow up, right? And you also benefit from them not needing additional assistance. And so in this way, public education creates a large positive externality. Very topical at the moment is also vaccines, right? So if a critical mass of people all receive a vaccine, each of those instances can be we can conceive of each of those instances as an individual transaction. Eventually, you reach a level of herd immunity where those that, for various reasons, couldn't get the vaccine receive some of the benefits of the vaccine, right? And so they're benefiting from this large positive externality. And externalities are very important in economics because oftentimes they're kind of sitting outside of our scope of view, and we really need to kind of broaden things to get a full picture of the consequences of any particular economic activity. So now we're going to start building towards our first formal model, the production possibilities frontier. And this model really exhibits the idea of economic trade-offs. Economic trade-offs exist because some inputs are scarce, and we lack the resources to achieve all goals simultaneously. And so because of that, we have to make decisions about what our priorities are. And so the PPF is going to be our first major model that kind of formalizes this idea a bit. But I should talk about what a model is, because I feel like this is something that economists talk about a lot that many other disciplines don't. A model is just like this imperfect image of the world that's looking at one specific thing. It's an analytical tool that highlights some aspects that we're interested in while ignoring others for the sake of simplicity. So any model that had a real, true picture of what the real world is like would be useless, because it would be so complex as to be incomprehensible. So we have to make these certain simplifying assumptions, but it's very important to be intentional about these assumptions and to know when they're occurring, because it helps tell us when a particular model will be applicable to the real world and when it might not be applicable to the real world. And so keeping that in mind, this is just a very simplified model. So here we have this graph. On the vertical axis, we have quantity of guns, and on the horizontal axis, we have quantities of butter. This is a classic story in economics, right? Of a country has a decision to make. It can make military products to protect itself, or it can make consumption goods for individuals to enjoy within its own borders. And it's got to make those trade-offs. So those could just as easily be capital goods and consumption goods, good A and good B, but we're just using this in this simplified example. The curve shape represents the fact that as we want to produce more and more of a single good, we have to give up more and more of the other good. So, for instance, starting at B, we have 100 butter and 5 guns. The opportunity cost of producing 20 more units of butter is only 5 guns. So that would move us from point B to a cost of 20 more units of butter. Right, so we'd be moving from B to A. But also, if we say we're moving the other direction there, so for instance, we're moving from producing 5 guns to producing 6 guns, we can see that that results in giving up about 20 units of butter. So the curve kind of makes the cost of producing more and more guns as we move further and further to the left along the curve more costly in terms of butter. The idea is that all points along the curve are efficient points where the economy is fully spun up. Everything is being used. All of our inputs are being used. Points within the curve are points that the economy can produce. So for instance, point E here, these are points that the economy can produce, but may not consume all inputs to production. And so these are inefficient points to produce at. Points like point D here are beyond our production possibilities frontier. And that means that we simply don't have enough inputs to produce, in this case, 8 guns and 80 butter at the same time. We just can't do it. So this also very clearly illustrates the idea of opportunity cost, which is closely related to economic trade-offs. An opportunity cost is the value of the best alternative that is foregone when a choice is made. So I've got the example there talking about moving from point B to point A, but to make this a little more realistic, the opportunity cost of attending college is the foregone income that could have been obtained by working instead, right? So you give that up in order to increase your human capital to be able to get a higher paying job in the future, right? And so these trade-offs happen. So we can alter this model just a bit. So in this model here, the axes are instead labeled quantity of current production and quantity of future production. So technological progress shifts this curve outward, and resource shocks could shift it inward. Some activities that if we overproduce in the present will reduce our ability to produce in the future. And so these trade-offs are taking place through time even. Here is an example where we can see that the future production possibility frontier with low resource maintenance is smaller than if we maintain high resource maintenance in the present. So simply, if we deplete our natural resources now, they're not available to produce in the future, so fewer bundles of output 1 and output 2 in this case are actually accessible to us. So maybe think about some possible productive activities that could increase our production possibility frontier in the future, and some that could decrease it. So, for example, do you think increased funding of public education would extend or contract our production possibilities frontier? Manufacturing lawnmowers, what's the consequence of that? Building a new interstate highway. So these are all things that have consequences on our productivity in the future, but we've got to make those choices in the present. So finally wrapping up, this is the last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is the circular flow diagram. And this is a very classic way of thinking about the economy. We divide the economy between households and firms, and households provide land, labor, and capital to firms so that those firms can produce things. So they produce goods and services, which then the households buy. And so that creates kind of the outer circle of this wheel that's going clockwise. The other circle is the flow of incomes. So households receive wages, rents, interest, and profits from the land, labor, and capital services that they offer to firms. And then in turn, households provide payments for the goods and services that firms produce. And so this is kind of the way that firms and households are tied together in the economy. And this is just a very classic picture. It does leave out many aspects that are important, and so I will offer an alternative way of thinking about this kind of large-scale flow of the economy in the next chapter. But that's all I've got for this one. So just wrapping it up, economists study the basic economic activities: resource management, production, distribution, and consumption. We are concerned about what is produced, how it is produced, and for whom. And finally, we use models to get some pictures about how the economy functions and what the impact of policies will be. but these are imperfect and useful only under certain circumstances where their assumptions are met. But anyway, I think that's it for Chapter 1, and thanks.